Hey, toy fans around the world. Today on Spectra Creative, we're going to be talking about little people. And no, I'm not talking about like Lilliputians. I'm talking about the original little people, these guys. And there's a ton of videos about little people on the internet. I'm Scott ToyGuru Neitlich. I've been in the toy industry for about 20 years plus, but I'm also a collector and a parent. And all of that has kind of given me some interesting insight about little people. Now, I'm not going to give the full history of the brand. There's plenty of videos out there that talk about the history of the brand and the importance of the brand, etc., etc. What I want to talk about specifically is, I guess, a part of the history, and that is how little people went from this sort of pin-shaped figure with a head, and were turned into this. More of a squishy, full-bodied figure with arms coming out and feet and hair and all sorts of stuff. So the quick version of the history, just as background, Little People started off as the Play Family, and the very first toy was the Play Family bus, which came with figures. Well, I guess if you'll call them figures, I don't know if they're action figures because they're not articulated, but they all sat inside the bus, and the bus had the little googly eyes that you may also be familiar with from the Fisher-Price telephone. As you rolled it, the eyes would google around, and you could fit the little characters inside. These are kind of proto-versions of what we know as classic Little People, but they still had that pin-shaped body. That was very important. We're going to get into that. Later on in the 60s and 70s is really when Little People hit their stride, when they started to introduce playsets, or play environments. And these really were some of the first true playsets for action figures, or for really playtime. They also had things like trains that included animals, included circus characters. You could put them inside. And it was really all about classic play. They focused their advertising on good old wholesome toys that didn't need batteries and could allow children to really play out imaginative, open-ended play using the play sets and the small pin-shaped figures as avatars to understand the world and to relate to such a huge, when you're a child, the world is ginormous. And being able to control things like a farm or a house or an airport is very, very empowering for a child, because they can have control over the plane, they can have control over the people, over the animals, and this helps children relate to the world and learn about how it works. Even fantasy sets started popping up in the 70s, like the very famous Fisher-Price Castle, which came with the awesome pink dragon, as well as the royal family and Robin Hood and some knights, and introduced things like trapdoors and secret passages. And of course, who could forget the Kentucky Fried Chicken Little People restaurant, which was also then redone as McDonald's, as well as other restaurants. And speaking of license sets, probably their most famous license was Sesame Street, which produced quite a few sets, one of the more famous being the Clubhouse set. This was actually one I had, which I really enjoyed. It was kind of my first play set. And to back up the play sets, they also had packs of additional characters. A lot of this set the precedent for the way toys are even packaged and sold today, with play sets, with additional figure sets, with additional vehicles, additional worlds. The Sesame Street world alone grew to multiple buildings, multiple play sets, multiple character add-on packs, and sort of became a whole mini-world within itself under the Little People play pattern. What was that play pattern? Well, I call it pin play. I made up that word, but it's essentially the ability to take those little figures and place them inside of things. Because of the shape of the figures, because they were, not shaped like bowling pins, but I use that word pin. They could pop into the vehicles. They could pop into the carousels, the seesaws, the swings. Here's a little demo, so you can see that the figure going down and into a secret passage. So why did all this change? Why can you no longer do what's called pin play with the little people? It's because of this book, Toys That Kill. I know the title sounds a little off-putting, but what's more important about this book than the jarring title is the fact that it had the little people front and center on the cover. Now, this book covered the entire history of dangerous toys, and there's some low-hanging fruit when you're dealing with the history of dangerous toys. In the 1950s, there was a science kit that actually came with real uranium for children to play with and create nuclear reactions, because that's what every child needs to do in their playroom, right? Obviously, a dangerous toy. But there's also parents that put their children at risk, and that was a big part of that. And the danger of little people wasn't necessarily the figures, but honestly, it was more parents who were not the greatest parents and were giving little people to infants, 3 months old. 3 months is way too young to play with little people. But because little people of all the toys spotlighted in this book were the ones chosen for the cover, well, that was an issue, because here you had them front and center on this book that said, Toys That Kill, and they're basically billboarding that little people are a dangerous toy. And if you actually read the chapters about little people, yes, there were children who had accidents with them, but they were 1 month old. They were 3 months old. These toys are not designed for 1 month old children. But assume that during that summer, this book came out in 1984, everyone's sitting around the pool reading this book. You've got it open, and again, billboarding right there. Dangerous toys, toys that kill, with little people right there on the cover. So wherever you look around the pool, you're seeing people read this book. Well, obviously, that's going to send the message, one, toy safety is needed. And this book did directly lead to new toy safety, but it created a little bit of a false narrative that little people in that shape are more dangerous than they are. So we didn't have age grades back then. Now we do. This book led to age grades. But it also meant that Fisher-Price, now owned by Mattel, needed to redesign the little people. Because even though if responsible parents had waited to give them to their children until they were at least 1 years old or 2 years old when they're appropriate, the accidents that happened with younger children led Fisher-Price to redesign the little people into more squishy little people with hands and hats and feet, etc., etc. They no longer had the thin pin-shaped body. So this meant that things like the classic Fisher-Price barn had to be transformed from something, well, not something like this, from this into this. So the new barn would utilize the larger characters, the larger animals, and the set became more of a facade than a full playset. So why is this an issue, if you will? And the reason that I bring this up is because the change from the pin shape to what I call the squishy character shape ended the play pattern, if you will. It literally, I don't want to say dramatically destroyed the play pattern, but it prevented little people had a very unique play pattern, what I called that pin play, being able to take the figures and put them on a slide. You could no longer do that. Now you needed a car for them to go on a slide because they wouldn't roll down the slide anymore. The pin shape of the original body is what let them do things like go through trapdoors or down slides like that. Changing them into these squishy shapes got rid of that play pattern. And now even Fisher-Price is offering little people for adult collectors, still in that squishy body. So different brands, like you just saw Masters of the Universe, or here is DC superheroes and supervillains, no longer in that pin shape that allowed, again, what I'm naming this, so I'm calling it pin play. They're now really more for display. I mean, at least these sets, I don't think kids are screaming for Yellow Submarine Beetles or Kiss figures, but that's okay, because it's great that adult collectors want to get little people to remind them of their childhood and collect them. There's nothing wrong with little people being used for the collector play pattern, which is about acquisition. But to me, as a parent, what's, I guess, sad is that you no longer have this shape, the shape that allows children to experience pin play. Now, I worked on this line Pinmates with Entertainment Earth and Big Bad Toy Store for a while, which looked at bringing back the original play pattern, but again, for adult collectors, but would still work for kids. This was done as essentially, again, a form factor change. So people who were already buying action figures of their favorite characters could now buy them for the first time in the classic Fisher-Price pin shape, including figures and vehicles, and even some play sets and display stands. What was great about these, though, is when we put them in front of kids and we gave them the old 1970s play sets, they completely picked up the play pattern like from day one. They immediately were constantly playing with them and putting them down the slides and shooting them down the trapdoors, things that the new little people can't do. I completely understand why Fisher-Price needed to change them, because, again, there were irresponsible parents in the early 80s giving them to children that were too young, and there were no age grades. So we did look at Entertainment Earth and Biff Bang Pow, at finding ways to bring back the playsets. We had a huge Infinity Gauntlet playset made for San Diego Comic-Con and encouraged children to come play with all the figures at the show. And it was amazing how parents had to actually tear their kids away from the playset. They were having so much fun, which to me just adds the evidence that this original play pattern that required the figures to be in a pin shape is a very, very unique way of playing with toys that is no longer offered by the current little people from Fisher-Price. Again, I understand why they had to change it. When people are billboarding with that book all summer long, with them being on the cover. But I kind of wonder, if they hadn't been on the cover, would we still be getting more pin-shaped characters today in all sorts of brands, especially for kids? You could find Pinmates at retail, but they're more of a collector item. They're not as much designed, or really marketed to children the way the original ones in the 70s were. And to me, yeah, this is kind of what I guess makes me a little sad, because the original shape allowed so much more play value than just doing little squishy people with arms and legs, because the shape allowed play to happen. I don't know if these will ever come back for kids. I kind of hope they do. I hope, Fisher-Price realizes that there is value in this, and that putting an age grade, an appropriate age grade on them, would keep them safe. The original Little People are a classic toy, and the reason for that is they had their own play pattern that no other toy can replicate. The play pattern of pin play was unique to them, and that's what made them such an important part of toy history, and one that I hope will come back, because you can still play with those old sets. You can find them in your attic or find them on eBay, but they're awesome. I hope you liked this video. I hope it was insightful. And if you've got questions or comments, I always reply to every comment I get. So leave them below. Give me a subscription or a like to tell YouTube to share this video with more people. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.